So, welcome to the December meeting of the Australian Zonta Says Now think tank. It's our last for the year. Where has the year gone? My name is Carol Theobald, and I am speaking to you today from the lands of the Wadjuk Noongar people in Western Australia. Technology permitting, I will be joined today by Sandra McLean from Queensland, Sue Lees and Sandra Burns from Victoria, Bridget Mather and Christine Trenorden, Christine Trenorden from South Australia, and Cheryl Scott from New South Wales. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping. Please share your location in the chat line and use the chat to ask any questions and make any comments. Please keep your microphone on mute, especially during the presentations. And in the Q&A, please ask short, succinct questions and use welcoming and inclusive language. Thank you. This is our programme for today, and I'll hand over to Christine Trenorden from South Australia to start us off. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Carol. Firstly, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in all the places we meet from today and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We usually acknowledge a female First Nations leader at the start of each meeting. Today, I would like to shine the spotlight on Vanessa Turnbull Roberts. Vanessa is a Bundjalung Widjabul Wiabul woman who early this year began her 5-year role as the ACT's inaugural Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Young People Commissioner. She was removed from her family at the age of 10 and has used her lived experience to explore new ways to transform the child protection system throughout the country. She is a survivor, a human rights advocate, a lawyer, and also a Fulbright scholar. She firmly believes that poverty should not result in punishment or removal, but rather support. Last month, Vanessa received Marie Claire's Changemaker of the Year award. Congratulations, Vanessa. We use this train to join the dots as to why Zonta says now to gender equal climate action. Increased carbon pollution has led to global heating that triggers extreme weather events that cause millions of people to lose their livelihoods and their homes. The social disruption magnifies any existing inequality, including gender inequality. Zonta Says Now stops the train by advocating for governments to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement and closing the gender gaps in leadership, education, economic opportunity, health, and safety. Life for women and girls at the end of the train is hard. We tend to think of this being a problem only in developing countries, but not so. These personas highlight the problems. Because of the drought, girls like Deborah walk further each day to collect water and have no time to go to school. And in Mozambique, Ayan's family lost everything in the floods, and she's being sold into marriage. But the climate crisis affects women's lives in Australia too. Bushfire smoke triggered young Eva's asthma. Her mother, Wei, is worried she will lose her casual job as she had to take time off work to look after Eva. And Maria is on a limited income in rented accommodation with no air conditioning. She has a heart condition that is made worse in extreme heat, and in summer walks to the local library each day to sit in the cool. Studies show that due to women's physiology, women don't cool down as quickly as men. For Jane, a tornado destroyed her home. She has a low-paying job, no savings, and is being continuously priced out of the rental market. She's had to move twice in 6 months, and her stress levels are sky high. And Katie was traumatised when floods destroyed her home and town, disrupting health and support services. She turned to drugs and alcohol to cope. She's now pregnant and struggling with substance abuse. Studies in South Asia have found that a 1 degree rise in average temperature is associated with a 6% rise in violence against women. This link is reflected in Gender and Disaster, Australia's work to remove negative stereotypes during disasters. These negative stereotypes harm both men and women. Social disruption is a huge trigger for widening gender gaps. In 2022, over 36 million people were displaced by climate events, and if we don't act now, this could rise to over 1 billion people by 2050. Sadly, 1 in 5 women, displaced women, experienced sexual violence. We need to plan solutions now for large numbers of displaced people in Australia and climate refugees from overseas in order to minimise social disruption. This is why Zonta Says Now seeks climate justice for women and girls so that they can prevent, prepare for, respond to and recover from the impacts on the same basis as men. I'll now hand over to Sue Lees to introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. So, thanks, Christine. Catherine Trundle, who is speaking today, is a medical anthropologist in the Department of Public Health at Trobe University. Medical anthropology is related to a subfield of anthropology. It tries to better understand factors which influence health and well-being at issues such as ecological adaptation and maladaptation. Catherine's current research focuses on heat stress and climate justice in Australia, asking how we might include a diverse voice and perspective to inform solutions to extreme heat. Her research engages different knowledge holders, communication, and organisers. This talk today is the gendered dimension of extreme heat. The talk will discuss the diverse ways gender shapes the experience of extreme heat. Catherine will explore how heat interacts with gender-based violence, care practices, and interacts with heat with women's health, parenting, and gendered workspaces. Also, how gender inequality interacts to impact women and women's rights. Catherine will discuss research in Australia as well as diverse international settings and consider the role of women's organisations whose actions can support women suffering from extreme heat. So thank you, Catherine. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm going to speak. And I just want to start by saying thank you to Sue, to Christine, and to Carol for this invitation and for that introduction. I want to give you a bit of a broad overview about how heat stress impacts women and girls. I am really interested in gender in my own research. I take a feminist lens in quite a lot of what I do, and I take a social justice lens. So I'm particularly interested in thinking about how inequities end up exacerbating harm for certain communities and groups compared to others. So I'm going to give you quite a high-level overview of the sort of factors that make women and girls more vulnerable to heat stress in Australia and the broader sort of Asia Pacific, which is where a lot of the research I've been looking at recently explores. But I think it's worth us just starting with a sort of a brief pause to think about what we mean by heat, because we often think about heat atmospherically. We think about heat as the air getting hot around us and causing damage. But I think actually it's really important to come back to what heat is, and heat is actually a form of energy. So I often sort of continue to ground myself in the sort of laws of thermodynamics when I think about heat and inequality, because it helps me a lot. So heat is a form of energy that's always trying to move. And heat energy, like all energy, is always conserved. We can't sort of create and destroy energy. We just merely transfer it from one object or location to another, from one state to another. So really, the key concern in a warming world is, how do we deal with the flow of heat? We can't live apart from it, but human power and human vulnerability and human care is really going to lie in how we can slow down or speed up heat's movement, redirecting it in ways that avoid harm. So we have to think of heat as really an interaction of bodies, environments, and atmosphere rather than simply atmosphere. And of course, heat is always trying to move towards cooler objects. That's the sort of second law of thermodynamics, is that heat's always moving, so keeping something cool in a steady state requires energy, it requires resources. And so heat is always trying to get in. And so women and girls and gender minorities are usually at greater risk of being vulnerable to heat because they can't keep heat out. Or heat gets stuck where they are, such as in the idea of a heat island, when we think about spaces that get hot quicker and for longer. So I think it's really important we think about heat not as just a atmospheric climate issue, but more as an interaction of bodies and their environments. I'm sure you all know about the sort of physical impacts of heat on the body. It's rather dramatic: cramps, dizziness, exhaustion, some of them nausea, vomiting. You know, a heat stroke is a really serious condition that can cause death. And so it's worth us just thinking first about, and I will spend most of this talk talking about the social dimensions that shape vulnerability, but actually there are some physical dimensions it's worth noting. Women are at greater risk during heat waves because their bodies are different. Women have usually a higher body fat percentage and a lower water content, and that actually really affects their heat tolerance and their hydration levels. Also, various issues around hormone fluctuations relating to menstrual cycles, to pregnancy, to menopause can actually make it harder for the body to regulate temperature. We also know with girls, young children, particularly infants, are at much greater risk of heat stress because they have a larger skin surface to mass ratio. So they have more surface area to their mass, and that means that they can heat up much quicker. And like older populations, they don't have as efficient sweat glands. They have fewer sweat glands, so they can't sweat as well. And we know that sweating is the body's primary mechanism for cooling the body. The body has to retain this really constant core temperature between sort of 36 and 37. And when the body gets really hot, it sends all the blood towards the skin, the arms, the legs, the head to cool down. And it's really the sweat that takes that heat out of the body, and it has to evaporate off. It can't drip off. So when you're in a humid climate, you can't cool down from sweating. It's the evaporation that really cools the skin, which is why humid climates feel so much more oppressive in the heat. We also know, as I said, that older people are at greater risk, and we know that women make up a larger portion of the older population. And that, again, is to do with the fact that their sweat pores become less functional over time, but also because older people, they have certain vulnerabilities around chronic health conditions like cardiovascular. Your heart has to work a lot harder in the heat to pump the blood around. So first of all, there are those really basic physiological things we just have to remember, but that's only a very small part of the story. Those physiological things do extend for pregnancy and maternal health. Heat waves on maternal health are quite significant. We know that heat affects low birth weight, preterm delivery, it affects stillbirth. Even just a 1 degree rise in maternal heat exposure has quite a huge impact on rates of miscarriage. We know that pregnancy lowers the body's ability to deal with heat. It often it makes the body more susceptible to stress and heat stress and dehydration. So there are these things that are sort of based on physiological things, but really the important things, because these are the things that make the really big difference, the interaction of a whole lot of social factors, our gender norms, our socioeconomic norms and inequities. We know that women are more likely to live in poorer households in Australia. We know that women are likely to earn 75% of what men earn in paid labour. We know that children account for a really large percentage of the global extreme poor. 44% of the global extreme poor are children. And of course, we know that that puts girls at high risk. We know that women live in houses with less air conditioning. We know that they live in poorer quality houses. All of these forms of systemic injustice around income have a greater impact on women. And then we can think also just more broadly about forms of systemic racism and the way in which discrimination and systemic racism impact communities of colour. We know in Australia that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have much greater barriers in accessing good quality housing. This creates an enormous amount of heat stress. It means that because of that lack of access to good quality housing, there may be more people living in a house, which can make it harder to keep cool, less access to air conditioning and other forms of cooling mechanisms. So these things are really important. And the other thing I want to stress is the importance of thinking about heat, not just at the disaster level. We often think about it in terms of extreme heat waves and people turning up in emergency rooms, but I really encourage you to think about heat right from the spectrum of those extreme effects to the subclinical levels, where a lot of impacts occur, particularly on women, I think. And those subclinical stresses, so I like the word heat stress because it captures everyday stresses and strains as well as bodies under a lot of stress. Just to give you some examples of some of the subclinical impacts on health of heat stress that you might not have thought about is this wonderful work being done on people who live in social housing in New South Wales. And those communities report that during times of extreme heat where they haven't been able to get access to air conditioning in their houses, that a lack of government support leaves them feeling very strongly a sense of being aggrieved and a feeling of inequality and of injustice and the stresses of feeling like you're not looked after by your society and are valued less. We know that people during times of extreme heat just are lonelier, that they report missing relatives and friends and feeling frustration and exhaustion about not being able to socialize and talk with each other. So when we think about heat stress and its impacts, gendered impacts, we should think as broadly as we can. But an obvious stress that comes immediately to many of our minds when we think of this is around care work. We know that women do twice as much unpaid care as men in Australia, childcare, housework. And we know that the main way that Australia has encouraged people to approach extreme heat and to keep themselves safe is through sort of health promotion material that seeks to shape individual behaviour. So increase your personal responsibility, check on your neighbours, check in on older people, your parents, deliver them food or make sure they've got the medications they need, make sure your kids stay hydrated, prepare smaller meals, make sure you have fruit and vegetables. These are all the sort of forms of responsibility we're encouraged to take on, and these are important things, but they become very hard to do for women, and particularly lower socioeconomic women or women that face forms of social discrimination. So I just want to, so it's not just that it's harder to look after yourself. If you're looking after others, that adds quite a big burden of care to look after others in the heat. For example, parents, mothers who are looking after children have to deal with the fact that kids are really grumpy in the heat. Part of that is because they can't go outside. They're stuck inside. But also they have, mood changes, they inability to cope, they get scratchy, they get anxious. If young people have mental health conditions, those are exacerbated in the heat. So women with care responsibilities are having to take on all of these things which are really stressful for them to do, especially if their resources and ability to control their environment are low. So we know that, between 16 and to 24-year-olds in Australia, that 40% have experienced mental health disorders at times in their life. And so if you're a mum and you're telling your teenagers, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, but if teenagers are experiencing mental health issues, and they themselves are going to have their levels of motivation, their abilities to enact self-care are going to be impacted, their ability to cope with anxiety, their ability to plan and make decisions, and even to communicate their needs are all going to be impacted by their own well-being. So parents are having to, and mothers who would take on a majority of often this care work, are having to navigate caring for others that may be hard to care for in those circumstances. Also, cool rooms tend to attract people. So if women do manage to keep their households cool, they tend to get extra visitors. They tend to, people, particularly in communities that are on limited incomes, people gravitate towards houses that are cool. So the care commitments of feeding and looking after people in those spaces, even if you are able to look after your own family, can increase, particularly in communities where there is a lot of need for and a lack of cool spaces in people's houses. Heat really disrupts kids' education and learning. Disrupted education and learning falls on women. We know that from what happened with COVID. Teachers in schools, in communities with inadequate housing, teachers, they report it just being really hard to teach kids at school. Often kids have been sleeping outside on mattresses because it's too hot to sleep inside in their houses. And so they come to school bitten by mosquitoes and they can't concentrate, or they come to school completely sleep deprived because they haven't been able to sleep through a hot house and during the night in a hot house. And so they're often missing out on a lot of education, and then there's extra pressure on both teachers and on parents and mothers to really try and address some of that. So all of these things are going on. One of the more, it's a simple thing, but heat stress, if your house doesn't cool down at night, if you don't have the capacity to cool your house at night, you don't sleep as well, and that makes everything worse. We all know that. But one of the more visible forms of harm is around domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence. We know that these rates, that there's a clear correlation in Australia and internationally between hot weather and violence. I think it's important we don't just sort of blame the violence on the heat. Violence needs to be kind of dealt with as violence, but we do know that lack of sleep, we know that sort of the irritability and the heightened stress do escalate and can escalate into aggression and violence more easily in the heat. And we also know that, for example, drinking might increase as a mechanism trying to stay cool. We know that just being in spaces together for longer increases the likelihood where there is domestic violence of that happening. We also know women find it much harder to access support for leaving abusive relationships during periods of extreme heat, that, mobility is limited. There is the services that are available to them are often working on a sort of limited capacity. They may be really worried, for example, about their pets in the extreme heat. So there's a lot of factors that make it harder to leave those situations as well. And in line with that, we know that forced marriages and trafficking go up in the Asia Pacific area in times of extreme heat. When families get under stress, forced marriages and trafficking becomes it becomes a coping mechanism that people are sort of pushed into. And there's a lot of evidence of this occurring in places like Bangladesh and Cambodia, Nepal, and also Papua New Guinea. I want to kind of just also mention elder care. Women make up more than 60% of the older population in the Asia Pacific. Women are also the ones that provide the majority of formal and informal care. They work in elder care institutions and facilities, and they provide the majority of the informal care. So, we know that becomes a sort of double burden for many women if they're looking after children and also trying to care for people, older people in their lives. And finally, I just want to really mention work. Because I think it's really important. There's quite a lot of visibility for certain forms of work that have heat stress, such as people who work outdoors, perhaps road workers, miners, or work underground. But actually, a lot of heat stress exists inside, in indoor spaces. People that work in food service, cleaners, domestic workers. We know that women have greater labour force vulnerability in terms of more part-time, more insecure, more informal work. And they're more likely to go without pay in a heat wave because of the fact that they don't have social protection and labour laws protecting them. And we know that since they earn less, they're less able to bear those losses compared with men. And I just also want to really emphasize that women do a lot of emotional labor jobs. So working in service industries and customer facing work, in health and social sector work, where they're doing a lot of interacting with people and a lot of emotional labor. And even if they themselves are working in cool places, they're often having to deal with irritable, tired, fed up, hot people, whether they're nurses, receptionists at doctors' clinics, even people working in cafes. These are spaces where their job gets harder and more stressful. And just to also sort of a final point about food security. We know that, for example, in the Asia Pacific, women often, there's a lot of ways in which women bear responsibility for producing food and domestic consumption, and with all gleaning and harvesting fish and things. And we know that, women, then there's the added burden of, during times of heat, not being able to provide for their families. And we also know women experience that, unequal allocation of food within a household during times of crisis. Research in Asia shows that, for example. And even here, it's worth pointing out that a lot of our social services that provide food security come under enormous stress in Australia during times of heat, and that both volunteers and recipients of food support struggle to both provide and receive those services. So just to conclude, I really just wanted to show you the myriad ripple effects that heat has on women and girls' lives, and the sort of cascading ways that these sort of impacts can build up, and to really stress that many of them don't present in an ER. Many of them simply present in heightened stress and anxiety and difficulty with getting through your life, and that these things are just as important as the big statistics that we have. And we should be thinking really holistically in terms of women's organizations and sort of collective efforts. I think that, there is really important work to be done in trying to push beyond a sort of individual responsibility health promotion model, which tends to dominate in Australia, towards thinking really hard about how we tailor information and access and support vulnerable communities. And I do think there's a real role to be played in organisations that are acutely focused on gender and helping to spotlight this need and also address this need. I'll stop there and answer questions. I think I have perfectly 20 minutes. I'm very pleased with. So thank you very much. I hope that was useful for thinking about heat and gender.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a very timely presentation, as we're all experiencing increased heat around the world. And I think you've taken us back to the everyday level, which was really important. Now, do we have some questions for Catherine? If you can either raise your hand. Vicky?
Vicky, yeah.
It's raised.
Thank you.
Hi, Vicky.
Hello, Dr. Catherine. It's lovely. That was most inspiring for me to. I'm really particularly interested on the women at home and the constant need to cook, prepare meals, etc. I know you touched on it in a sense, but I'm really interested in that aspect of it. And it must be increasingly much more difficult with the increase in temperatures, as well as you're talking about on the body in those environments. Have you got any more on that information?
Yeah, I don't have stats. That's a hard thing to capture in stats, but you're
Yes.
absolutely right. So if you're in front of a stove, you're getting hot. Anyone at home in front of a stove, so the recommendation is you eat lots of fruits and salads and things. That's really hard for people to do on a really low income because fruit and vegetables expensive. So the sort of fresh cold food requires either that you can afford expensive fruit and vegetables, or that you can prepare carbohydrates in advance and put them in the fridge and stuff. But that requires you to have good sort of income all the time to be able to kind of think and time to plan ahead. So I actually think cooking presents quite a big stress. Interestingly, a lot of women in households, in family households on low incomes report that they find it so stressful they get takeaway delivered. And then they feel really guilty. So guilt, I think, is a really interesting that they're not nutritionally providing for their, they feel guilty they're not nutritionally providing for their families. They're getting the advice to provide salads and they are doing the sort of opposite. But it's one way of avoiding cooking. But of course, it puts other people at risk because food delivery people are at quite a high risk in those, and they have very low security and have a lot of demands on them to get food. So that sort of externalizes the risk. It doesn't erase it. And often, another thing, so women can also be stressed about just even getting food to their families. There's some research that shows in communities where houses don't cool at night, the kids just leave in the evening because it's actually cooler outside by that point. And they often stay out all night. And then, of course, there's a lot of worry that comes with not, providing them with meals, but also just worried about what they're up to. So there's a whole set of sort of interrelated stresses that come around providing that sort of shuttle out from that. I've talked to students who work in cafes in Melbourne about what it's like on hot days, and many of them are women, and they talk about how hot it is to be in front of a coffee machine. And also just how hot that because cafes want to keep their doors open to let customers in and out, often all customers are coming in and out. It's very hard to keep those spaces cool. So they just get really hot. So it's that, and people working for preparing food in kitchens are in exactly the same situation. So I think it's worth us just thinking about food and food equity as a big underlying issue here. It's a very good question, Vicky.
Thanks. Just extending that a little, if I may, is that, yes, what we can appreciate everything you've just said, but in countries where it culturally is such that the women don't have any choice, certainly not takeaway, is that they have to remain in that setting, virtually all day. Certainly all day until the late evening, something like that. So are you looking at any of those sorts of scenarios?
I haven't come across any sort of data on that. And I have had some small conversations in some interviews I've done about a sort of gender roles in and space, so where people are, and for example, in cultural contexts where the men may go out and gather outside in the evening, or outside, and women may gather inside. So there being some inequity around it's not always straightforward, but there can be. It depends on whether the home is cool or not. But absolutely, those cultural norms. It's also worth just pointing out that with those risks often come strengths, so that there are a whole lot of often cultural sort of adaptive strategies, particularly. So in Australia, it's some of the literature has sort of pointing out that some of our migrant communities come from cultures that are quite hot, and so actually have already a set of strategies in place, and that rather than treating them simply as a vulnerable group, we should think of them as knowledge holders with lived experience that goes back a long way, and that we could in fact be trying to build collaborative research with them where their knowledge gets spotlighted rather than just sort of thinking of them as vulnerable. So good point.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicky.
Okay, I think we might, if there's nobody I can see with, Christine, sorry, yep, go ahead.
You're on mute.
Yes, thanks, Sue. Just one small question. Have you done any work looking at the differences between women in urban settings and women in rural or regional settings? Because it seems to me one of the living in an urban environment, the heat, I suspect, I don't know, I suspect the heat stress is exacerbated. I mean, we know it's hotter living in the suburbs than further afield. But has there been any work done on the different stresses on women in an urban area compared with rural or regional country?
There's been work done in Australia on the differences, but it hasn't focused on gender so much. It's a really good question, but it will play out in terms of gender. But the differences, so there are just, so for example, in urban settings, women that I've spoken to have taught who live in rented accommodation, they describe the insecurity of their windows at night. So they want to open the windows, but the windows don't have secure locks. And so it's really important on hot days that you open and you vent your house at night, because that's when it's cool. You let all the hot air out and then you close it down. This is the kind of main strategy that we're being taught to sort of utilize. But you can't do that at night if you are a woman in a house that has windows that, you can't sort of securely fasten at a certain sort of opening. And I think that probably is very specific to sort of urban settings and risks around crime or perceptions of them and fear, which are, real and legitimate. I think in rural communities, one of the big issues that has been identified is isolation. People being quite a distance from others, so the sort of ability to check in makes things harder. There's also been really interesting work showing how actually people who've sort of raised in rural and remote communities actually do have quite a lot of adaptive strategies for heat, because they're sort of in many ways more exposed to the elements, and they're sort of used to it. And they're in places where there are bushfires, they're used to that double whammy. So there's kind of quite a lot of adaptation there. But what we're seeing, and this is also with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we are seeing that despite amazing cultural adaptation, we're reaching the limit thresholds of the human body, in terms of what culture can do to adapt. And so I think it's, those, there's research that shows, for example, that pregnant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women where they don't have a car, for example, getting to a hospital or getting to their clinic appointments when they live in remote and rural areas, it puts them under enormous heat strain, and they have higher rates of maternal health issues. And so there's all of those things that sort of play out with access to transport and access and isolation, I think, too. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
It needs
All
more
right.
study, I think. Yeah.
I think we'll close the. Oh no, Carol, we want to say something.
I just wanted to have, if we wanted to advocate in this area, what area should we focus on to make the most difference?
Oh, now that's a really good question. In an Australian context, I think some of the most, I think there's already good work going on around trying to get services in terms of gender violence services. So I think that's making them really adaptive to the heat. And raising awareness. So I think that's ongoing, but I think that I actually think just all of the everyday burdens around care are huge. And I think thinking about how we cannot individualize those problems to just individual women, but to think about how our social services might really support looking after dependents and offering. I actually think that would make a really big difference especially to women with more vulnerability to heat and lower resources. So I think focusing it there, and I think there's a lot of interesting work already, because one of the big issues around heat is housing. So you've sort of got the environmental heat that comes from whether there's enough green space, and then you've got how well our houses are adapted. So there's already groups such as renter advocates and communities that are social organizations that are supporting care, providing good care facilities. But the fact is that, all of the support systems that women have tend to just completely fall off. All of the social services around looking after kids or helping them looking after elder people, they all fall away because those services often just can't function in the heat. So thinking about the whole infrastructure, I think would be really, really good, because those stresses and strains then end up leading to illness. If you have all of those strains, they end up becoming, they're subclinical, but they become clinical because they build up over time. So
I noted that in the city of Toronto, they've brought out a bylaw that requires all rented accommodation to have air conditioning that keeps temperatures below 23 degrees in their summer in Toronto.
Yes. So if a house is cool, then all of these these juggles that women are doing around trying to prepare cold food and they're dealing with scratchy kids, they're largely kind of dealt with. And so even just really simple infrastructural things will have a really big impact.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, I think we'll close off the questioning now. Catherine, I just want to say thank you so much for making the time today. I think you've given us such a useful talk, because we've now got areas where we can see that advocacy in the future could be very worthwhile. We've also got the education to us of how to talk to people about the impact of increased heat, because often when you try to talk about a big picture, people don't really get it. But when you can turn it around because of that big picture and show them, this is your family, this is what's happening to them, this is your mother-in-law, this is your pregnant wife. So I think we really appreciated all that today and learned so much. Can we invite you to stay for the rest of the meeting if you've got time? We will be going over what's happening with international and national issues.
I'd be happy to, be interested.
That'd be brilliant. But if anybody else needs to go at the moment, you're welcome to, or stay. So thank you. And I'm now going to pass over so that we can hear the international news. Carol and Sandra.
Yes, hello. Carol's done me some amazing notes, so I will talk to them. It's been a pretty busy last couple of months, I'd say, internationally. We've had some pretty major climate conferences around the world. So the first one we're going to talk about was in September, which was the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by over 190 countries. and it aims to turbocharge the sustainable development goals and the Paris Agreement. So this means that they want to listen to young people more and include them in decision making, to build stronger partnerships with civil society, redouble efforts to build and sustain peaceful and just societies, protect all civilians in armed conflict, and the most important from our perspective is to accelerate the implementation of commitments on women, peace and security as well. So there were 2 other documents that accompanied the pact, and this was a global digital compact, which looks at digital inclusion and how to govern AI and how to use tech within a human rights framework. And then the Declaration on Future Generations looks at caring for future generations and considering their needs in the decision-making process. Then October, we had the biodiversity COP16. I love all these acronyms. It's just like the public service. Anyway, so COP16 took place in Cali in Colombia. And there were over 23,000 attendees, which is pretty extraordinary, with over 1 million participating in the Green Zone events on the summit sidelines. So that just gives you an idea of the size of these events. So it had mixed outcomes, and I'm sure some of you might have seen it on the news. The Cali Fund was set up to collect funds from companies using genetic information that will be allocated to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And in addition, a subsidiary body will be set up for Indigenous peoples and local communities to take part in decision-making on biodiversity. However, there was a bit of chaos at the end when countries could not agree on a financing model or a monitoring mechanism to implement the Kunming-Montreal Global Framework for Biodiversity, which was agreed at COP15. Then in November, there was the Climate COP29, which was held in Baku in Azerbaijan. And this had 54,000 attendees. And actually one of our Zontians from our Brisbane club, Katrina Swanston, attended this event. She works for a social impact organisation, and I'm going to catch up with her in the next couple of weeks to talk to her about attending that conference. So while this year's COP was heralded as the most gender balanced in registrations, women accounted for just 35% of delegates, which was up from 34% at COP28. And of the 78 world leaders who attended, just 8 were women, and only 4 addressed gender-specific issues in their statements. And then, of course, we had the fallout over money, with over only $300 billion of the $1 trillion which were requested by developing countries being mobilised to help them adapt to climate change. So the target is to achieve $1.3 trillion a year by 2035. So the Lima program on gender was extended for another 10 years. However, it did not get additional funding to support implementation. But on a positive note, the United Kingdom promised to cut its emissions by 81% by 2035 and Brazil by 67% by 2035. Australia has no target beyond its 43% reduction by 2030. Sadly, the statement to transition away from fossil fuels agreed at the last COP was removed in this year's statements. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. By the way, Australia thought it would be good to get the nod to host the 2026 climate COP, but Turkey is also making a bid. And delegates could not decide between the two. So we'll have to see what happens in the coming months as the two countries thrash it out. And I know that both Adelaide and Brisbane are looking to host that COP. So let's see how we go. Hopefully we won't be dividing and conquering over that one. So in November, the United Nations Environment Programme tried to complete negotiations to create a legally binding global plastic treaty. So the delegates failed to reach an agreement. Basically, while 100 nations wanted to cap plastic production, there were a handful of plastic producing nations that only wanted to focus on plastic waste. So it all became too hard and the talks were postponed. So plastic production is expected to triple by 2050. And who is most susceptible to plastic toxicity? You guessed it, women and children. And finally this month, the UN desertification COP16 is being held in Saudi Arabia, and Carol has a video to share.
Our land, the foundation of life itself, the source of fresh water, crops and raw materials, the lifeline of forests, rangelands, wetlands, and other vital habitats. Yet, beneath our feet, a crisis unfolds. Land degradation is affecting every corner of the planet, causing biodiversity loss, reduced water quality, food insecurity, and forest migration. 40% of the world's land is already degraded, impacting 3.2 billion people. That's nearly half of humanity. Deforestation, overgrazing, unsustainable agriculture, industrial practices. We are pushing our land to the brink, and it is our future that hangs in the balance. We need to act now to reverse it. The world needs to restore 1.5 billion hectares of degraded land by 2030. Around the world, a growing movement is already starting. From Africa's Great Green Wall, working to restore 100 million hectares of land south of the Sahara, to the Middle East Green Initiative, planting 50 billion trees across Asia and Africa, and the Bond Challenge, aiming for 350 million hectares restored by 2030. Global initiatives are underway, but greater action is needed. Countries must establish restoration targets, and the private sector needs to increase its participation, recognizing that half of global GDP depends on natural capital. Lasting change requires sustained investment. We have the solutions to achieve land degradation neutrality. It's now time to use them for our land, for our future, for every life that hangs in the balance.
Back to you, Sandra.
Yeah, I guess just to close off on that section following the video, COP16 has highlighted the urgent link between desertification, land degradation, and drought. And these are obviously worsening migration, forced migration, and threatening global stability and obviously our food sources. So as Carol said, up to 40% of the world's agricultural land is already degraded, and this figure will increase each year. So the Riyadh Drought Resilience Partnership was launched to serve as a one-stop shop for drought resilience, promoting the shift from reactive relief response after drought hits to proactive preparedness. So I'll hand over to Carol now to tell us what's happening with Zonta Says Now internationally.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, the virtual art gallery is now open for entries for 2025, and it will be shared on Earth Day on the 22nd of April next year. The entry process has been streamlined with a new online entry form, and it's also available in multiple languages. Entries open to Zontians and their families, and this year for the first time we're allowing some artificial intelligence generated exhibits in certain categories. Anyway, so how will you express your feelings for how the world is responding to climate change and gender justice? You could do it by a painting, sculpture, quilt, poetry, knitting, photograph. The list is endless. And so what are you waiting for? Let your creative juices flow and get creative over the holidays. Get the camera out, take something. The International Working Group has just completed the Why We Need Gender Equal Climate Justice fact sheet. And this is basically a primer for the series. It's about 30 pages of photos, facts and links, along with practical ideas to show you how to take gender equal climate action. So I urge you to check it out. I'm not sure how many of you have seen the fact sheet on women's economic opportunities in the context of climate change. And that one and the primer are both available on the Zonta International website. There are 2 more fact sheets under development, and we hope to publish them in the new year. We're looking at the women in environmentally sustainable decision making and also consolidating the information we have around women and disaster preparedness. And the working group's creating videos and PowerPoint presentations to complement the fact sheets. So what's been happening with Zonta Australia? I'm going to go back to Sandra because I think Bridget is still out and about.
Okay. Well, we have also Petra here from Zonta Australia. So if I forget anything, Petra, you can jump in. Um, so I'm just going to give an update. Yeah, so Zonta Australia was, I don't know if you're aware, was formed at the Zonta International Convention, which was in June. So it's been a pretty busy 6 months where we've spent the time basically getting to know each other, I guess, and also looking to reach out to other groups that align with Zonta's objectives and missions and goals. And we've been meeting monthly since July. So our November meeting was the last one for the year. And really the focus of that is creating, obviously we need a good platform to communicate with people around what Zonta Australia is and how it works very closely with other Zonta clubs in Australia. We are the national voice that really works with clubs across Australia to collaborate with clubs to, to mobilise their voice and to work with them and to help get those, Zonta's objectives to the national, to a national audience, in particular national influencers. So we're looking at a website which is in development now, and we're hoping to have that launched in January, which will be great. We had a meeting with Kate Thwaites, who's a Federal Assistant Minister for Women, on the 14th of November, and that meeting was really just to talk with her to understand what the Australian government had and their priorities in relation to women and key issues. And the general agreement was that it was a great meeting with a note for Zonta Australia to consider her presentation as a good way to communicate our key issues. It was good to see her talking about things that we also feel strongly about. District 22 Governor Petra has a meeting with Stephanie Copers-Campbell, which is coming up soon. I think, Petra, have you had that meeting?
On Friday. So I'm going to give her a little spiel on Zonta Australia and, I mean, basically find out what in fact her role is. I think she's doing a lot of overseas travel, but I guess what is her role in Australia and how might we link in with that? So a bit of a question and answer thing. So just see how we go.
Yeah, her title is Ambassador for Gender Equality. So yeah, good-o. Okay.
Yep.
So the committee received confirmation from the Office of the Governor General. We requested for the Governor General to be the patron of Zonta Australia. So they have received that request and we're just waiting for a response. And we're also considering the recently released government response to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee report on missing and murdered First Nations women and children, and just trying to understand what our appropriate response might be on that. And we consider the 2025 federal election a really significant focus in the new year, and the committee needs to consider its role in leading a position for Zonta to federal government representatives. And I think, as you are all well aware, that climate and energy will be a key election issue. So I think it's probably good for us to understand what Zonta might, or Zonta says now, might consider some sort of approach in that. Anyway, something to think about. And also, Bridget attended a meeting with the Zonta International President, Sala, of the Global Leaders Group, and that was just to meet other, leaders of groups around the world who are in different countries that have formed caucuses or committees like Zonta Australia, and there are actually 14 countries around the world that have peak national Zonta committees, which is pretty good. So I think that's a pretty smart move of Sala to try and get those groups together, because we're obviously newbies and we're trying to learn how other countries are working in this way. And we did have a really good meeting with the American caucus, and it was great to understand how they work. We have 3 districts. I think they have 13. Is that right, Petra? So yeah, they have a much more complex picture. Yeah. And so Sala's been really great. She's been quite complimentary of our work, and she has a very strong message of the need for the Zonta voice to advocate at the national level, and she's very keen for us to work collaboratively with clubs and also with other groups around the world. And I'm now going to hand over to Cheryl Scott to tell you about her experience at the SCAP meeting in Bangkok.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. I apologise, first of all, for being late. I have family here at the moment. I was actually out looking at planes. If any of you know me, that's not unusual, but so I was a bit late. I apologise. The Beijing Plus 30 ESCAP meeting began with a youth forum to start off, and then they moved into 2 days of the civil society participants, and which there were 300 people attending those for 2 days of workshops. Feedback was that they were excellently organised and very worthwhile because you met the other participants from all around the Asian Pacific area. There were common threads for the future that many of the countries and the CSO groups were concerned about, and these included that CSO and governments must work together to promote Beijing agenda, strengthen women's leadership, and to raise women's voices in decision-making at all levels: participation, evaluation, accountability, and transparency. Now, very interestingly, the contracts for the alliances at the moment that have just been awarded do not permit those alliances to work in the international space or even across states or within states. It's only into the national level, which is very restricting when we want to actually have a say in decision-making about the wider gender equality agenda as what I'm talking about now. Climate change was frequently discussed, where women were left behind. And to collaborate to continue to move forward, forming equitable societies, improve gender-responsive policy, strengthen labour laws and economic security. And a lot of the labour laws in countries are non-existent, and particularly vulnerable, makes it vulnerable for women. To ensure all women's safety, including gender diverse communities, and embrace diversity. And a lot of countries mentioned gender diversity. There are the very conservative countries like Iran that found that language very controversial, and they wanted it to be known that they did not agree with the conclusions at the end of it. To ensure women and children's safety in areas of conflict with an emphasis on peace and security, that was very strongly spoken about. And the right to an education for all, whether living remotely, rural, and very importantly, in this part of the world, in the maritime environment. To ensure sustainable funding to improve legal, social health, and education for women and girls. Education was talked about a lot. And many of the CSO speakers told stories of the consequence for activists who spoke about and questioned the patriarchal societal norms from India to the Pacific Islands. I found the reports from ESCAP countries very interesting. But after speaking to CSO members from the different countries, found that the report from the government did not match the circumstances that on the ground for women living or working in their communities. Poverty, lack of continued education, early marriage, violence towards women, poor sanitation and health concerns, and mental health with access to support and childcare were also often mentioned. Yesterday, I had a meeting with the Australians that went to Bangkok with me, and I've been part of, and Bridget and I've been part of writing the report, as you know, for the last 6 months. And there was general agreement that the Beijing Review hadn't been reviewing new challenges, globalization, environmental degradation, digital age, conservatism, regressing women's rights, and increased violence towards women. It actually is a lot of those issues are actually weren't as apparent as they are now. To get movement and change of CSW needs to be a serious regional dialogue with CSO. And as the chair of CSW is actually from Saudi Arabia, when it is going to be very interesting, watch the space. And I'll hand over now to Carol to wind up the meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you've had quite a year. Thank you, Cheryl, for that. It must have been quite an experience going to Bangkok and being part of that international conversation. So thank you for sharing what you had. So what else has been happening? Sue, did you want to mention a bit about this that you're doing at the Zonta Club of Melbourne on Yarra with the District 23 Women Taking Climate Action awardee?
Okay. So this year, the Women Taking Climate Action. Oh, sorry, hold on. I've got 3 dogs here. So when I took it off mute, you just heard them. So the Women Taking Climate Action Award for the first time has become a District 23 project. And basically that means that anybody from District 23 can apply for it, but also that clubs from District 23 have been putting in $50 each to support the scholarship, which is $1,000. And we did make that money. We had enough interest from clubs to actually raise that $1,000, so that was fantastic. So the winner this year is Jane Baker, who actually has a distillery in near Maryborough in Victoria, and she will come to the Zonta Club of Melbourne on Yarra on Thursday the 13th of March at 7 p.m. at the Amora Hotel. We will Zoom, but if you're in Melbourne and you would like to come, there is a cost. It's about $55, I think, for a 2-course meal at the hotel. But I've been speaking a lot to Jane on email and message and phone, and she's absolutely thrilled. And the Zonta Club of the Gold something, that Zonta Club up near Maryborough put her forward. Goldfields, Zonta Club of the Goldfields, and they're also very thrilled too. So a really good outcome this year, and hopefully we'll go to even bigger and better in 2025. But I just should say that the reason that Jane was chosen is because basically she's built up a sustainable business by using renewable energy, by looking at the processes by which she's making the gin and whiskey, and making sure that they're environmental and sustainable, even to how they send their items in the mail to get to people. How can they make that as environmental as possible? So that they're really thinking all the time about this issue, and it actually is working. They are very viable business. They're doing well across Victoria, I know. So it's be really interesting to actually talk to a businesswoman who's won the award now, and what she can actually do as a business person, because often we're told, oh no, business people can't afford to do this. And she's actually saying, well, actually we can, and have a healthy business.
Excellent.
So back to you, Carol.
Thank you, Sue. It's nice to see what's going on. The world's biggest legal case has just begun in the International Court of Justice. I just want you to be aware. So during 2 weeks of hearings, 15 judges from around the world will be deciding basically on 2 things. What states should be legally required to do to combat climate change, and what the legal consequences should be when states cause significant harm through their actions or inactions. So that's going to be an interesting one to see what happens. We expect an advisory opinion in 2025, but there's dozens of countries involved in that one. I hope this will work. Sometimes all of the news that we get, listening to all those international climate conferences can be quite depressing, and the lack of progress. But let's listen to these wise words from Jane Fonda. I hope it'll work. I'll just be quick to get it in. Let's see.
Greta Thunberg said something really great. You know, everybody goes looking for hope. Hope is where there's action, so look for action, and hope will come. Ever since I'm doing 100% of what I'm capable in confronting the climate crisis, I don't get depressed anymore. I get angry, but I'm not depressed. Action is good. It's like hope is a muscle. It's like the heart. It's a muscle, and you have to activate it to feel it. It's very different than optimism. Optimism is everything's going to be fine, but you don't do anything to make sure that that's true. Hope is, I'm hopeful and I'm going to work like hell to make it true.
There we go. We're back again. I always find Jane Fonda amazing. I don't know how old she is now, but she's always looked after herself. Anyway, talking of hope, how about giving the gift of hope for Christmas and making a donation to the foundation? We always like to push the foundation because it's a very worthwhile cause. Anyway, there was a competition recently. The Nikon Comedy Wildlife Awards were announced yesterday. And this is probably how we all feel a bit after hearing about the ups and downs of climate negotiations and Christmas coming up. But I quite like that one. They had this other photograph. A fish can catch an eagle. So it's just amazing. Here's the proof. Anything can happen. So don't give up hope because you just don't know what's around the corner. And then this is the one that actually won the competition of a stuck squirrel in a tree. So I do hope that these have just brought a smile to your face after all the things that we've been through this year. I just want to just check with you all. I want to make sure that there's no questions or anything in the chat line. Sandra, is there anything in there, Sandra Burns? Anyone have any other questions that they wanted to ask or any comments that they would like to make about the year?
I don't think there's any other comments in there.
Okay,
Let me just
Thanks
get
very much.
down.
That's super. Sue, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to say, and I think I'm saying for everyone, how fantastic it is to be a member of Zonta Says Now. I think we each learn so much every time we have a meeting. We go away well prepared to kind of look at different areas, well prepared to have conversations with people with new ideas of things that we can actually do. So thank you, Carol, for having the idea in the first place that has created that opportunity. And thank you to all the people who are involved with working with Zonta Says Now, because it's really amazing what what was originally a small number of people and now a really growing number can do.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And thank you everyone throughout the year. It's been wonderful to work with you all, and we're all learning by doing. And I just want to give my special thanks today to Catherine for her talk. I mean, we had nearly 40 degrees here today. The other day in Perth were high 30s, well, about 30 today, but higher in the rest of the week. And we really feel, dread summer coming sometimes, but the words which you say, it's such a valuable area of research. So I'm really going to be interested to see what you come up with and what solutions we can find together to make life a bit easier for people as we face, because it's going to get worse. The weather's going to get worse as time goes on. So that's really important. Okay, so it only leaves me to say today that our next meeting, which is going to be in February, Saturday, the 8th of February. And we're trying to get Leonie Noble to speak. So we just need confirmation from her. And so we'll keep your fingers crossed on that one. I think Cheryl's onto that one. So we've got a bit of time. So you can, if you need to go now, you can go. And I just want to thank you to all the co-presenters today for helping out and making today's meeting so interesting. We've had a really busy year with the convention and the birth of Zonta Australia. So thank you for your energy, enthusiasm and support in 2024. And let's see what we can achieve together in 2025. So I'm wishing you all the best for a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. So keep breathing, keep smiling and have fun. Bye.
Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. See ya.
Thanks, Carol.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Bye. Merry Christmas.
Bye.
Merry Christmas.